Welcome to Torah Smash, the podcast for nerdy Jews, where our lives of Jewish learning collide with our love of nerd culture. In each episode, we discuss what we lovingly call a Torah Smash, which we have defined as a beautiful collision of one thing from the world of Judaism with another from nerd culture. I'm Ethan Lane Miller, and joining me today are
Barak Malkin.
RDY.
So today's episode, by the time you all hear this, it's going to be long past Purim. But today's episode starts with an excerpt from the book of Esther, chapter 9. This quote is, "So the Jews struck at their enemies with the sword, slaying and destroying. They wreaked their will upon their enemies. In the fortress Shushan, the Jews killed a total of 500 men." Now, it goes on later, and I'm going to paraphrase at this point. Later, King Ahasuerus asked Esther, "Okay, what else do we need to do here? What else do you want? Let me know and we will decree it and it will happen." And she says, "Well, I'd like it if the Jews were permitted to continue to act as we did, to continue doing what we did. Oh, and by the way, we'd love to impale Haman's 10 sons on the stake." So the king issues the decree, and Haman's 10 sons are impaled, and the Jews kill.
This has never made it into one of the Purim spiels that I've ever seen.
You took one of my jokes, Barak. You took one of my jokes.
Also, this is after the sons of Haman are killed. So
this is after?
They're impaled after they're killed. Like, they're already dead. She wants their bodies on display.
Oh, that's a good distinction. Okay.
Oh my God.
So Haman's sons are dead. We decide that's not enough. So the king issues a decree, and Haman's 10 sons were impaled. And then the Jews killed 300 more men, and word got out to the other provinces, and the Jews killed 75,000 of their enemies. Now, Barak, my next comment was going to be, wow, I need to talk to Rabbi Leah Berkowitz because I must have missed that part in the Purim spiel this year.
It's definitely not in Vashti's comfy pants.
No,
it is. Yeah, that part definitely was not. So,
like, all of this, and they read the Megillah and the translation, and it feels like I'm either not paying close enough attention or they like mumble through it because it's a lot of killing.
Well, there is a custom that when you read the names of Haman's sons that you say it all in one breath.
Oh.
So yeah, they are rushing through it.
Okay.
So I have more, but I want to pause there and see if I can get an early guess out of y'all.
Oh my gosh.
For where this is going.
Yeah, this is all of nerd culture we're guessing from.
Yeah. Just take one guess, and I'll try and like hone in on it a little bit.
Is this the destruction of the Death Star?
Oh, that's a great guess. No, but that'd be great.
Is this like, it feels like a Game of Thrones or the 300 scenario?
Also no. So here, let me hone in a little.
Yeah.
Bit. But I like where your head's at, and RDY, that could be a whole nother episode.
The head's at, was that an impalement joke?
Oh,
that was good. Great. So Judaism is filled with stories. And if we go looking, we can also find the stories that we don't tell. So we don't talk about how the Jewish people went on a rampage at the ending of the Purim story. We kind of gloss over the fact that Jacob remained married to Leah and he had 2 wives. And then, of course, we have King David and his multiple partners and concubines. So I guess my touchstone question for this episode is, how do we pick or decide what stories to tell?
Ooh.
Wait, are we answering that question now and not guessing?
Well, that question helps lead into what is the connection to nerd culture.
Like what's in the canon and what's not.
You got it right there.
Oh, like retconning versus just fan fiction versus let's ignore that and restart is this restarting the DC universe like 4 times?
So my nerd touchstone for this is Star Wars and Disney. So when this episode comes out, it'll be the lead in to May the 4th. And there are so many other nerd culture things.
May the 4th be with you.
And also with you. There's so many nerd culture examples of this, but in honor of May the 4th, I thought it'd be nice to talk a little bit about Star Wars and Disney and what happened to what was known as the expanded universe for Star Wars. So, a long, long time ago, in a not so far away land of George Lucas's house, for a small sum of, I think, $1 billion, George Lucas sold the rights for Star Wars to Disney. And Disney promptly announced that they were going to make a sequel trilogy. And suddenly there was a lot of hand-wringing because for years and years, literal, at least 2 decades, what happens after the original trilogy, after Return of the Jedi, had been answered by comics, by novels, by video games. There were years upon years of these stories of Luke Skywalker, Han and Leia and Chewie and Lando and their children, and then sometimes their children's children, of what happened to them. And Disney made the decision and said, you know what? None of that exists anymore. We're done. Characters like Talon Card, Mara Jade, Grand Admiral Thrawn, Jason and Jaina Solo, gone instantly.
It's like they've wiped my memory. I don't think I've ever heard of them. Like right? RDY, have you heard of these characters?
No, but I also didn't read any of the books.
I was going to say, maybe Ethan avoided the mind wipe.
So a lot of what we consider to be the expanded universe now started with, and I've mentioned him before because he's such an incredible author, was Timothy Zahn's Star Wars trilogy back in the early 90s, Heir to the Empire, Dark Force Rising, and The Last Command. And they introduced a lot of ideas. Leia's Jedi training, her and Han having twins, Jason and Jaina Solo, and a villain in Grand Admiral Thrawn, as well as Mara Jade, who, spoiler alert, for something that came out, say, nearly 30 years ago and also is no longer canon, eventually marries Luke Skywalker and has his child. RDY is making a face right now.
So Mara Jade is not one of Leia and Han's children, right?
Nope.
Okay. Then ignore my face.
Mara Jade was actually one of the hands of the Empire, which is another thing that doesn't exist anymore. But these characters just suddenly went out the window, wiped away, gone. So how do we choose what stories to tell and what stories not to tell? I have these books sitting on my shelf of these characters that are no longer considered to be a part of the canon. And for Sister Susan, RDY, canon in this case, referring to like the authors of the story and not a canon as in a big gun.
Yeah, one N.
Yes, one N, CANON.
Now, we have a huge tradition in Judaism of creating midrash.
Mm-hmm.
So the stuff that's not canon is incredibly powerful. Is this part of where you're going?
It is part of what I'd like to explore. I mean, there's certainly the idea of midrash had come to mind, but at least in my interpretation, midrash is discussion, not necessarily saying, oh, here's the chapter about where Moses took a side quest over to this city and this all happened in the middle of the Exodus.
Well, it's like if when Reformed Judaism was created, right, out of Orthodox and conservative Judaism, if when Reformed Judaism formed, they said, you know what, we're not going to tell the story of Esther anymore. Let's leave that behind and we're going to start fresh right here. So I don't know if there's any stories, tales, books that were left behind when different sects of Judaism branched out, but that sounds like what you're talking about.
There have to be. Well, because
we don't know, right? Just like our children's children will never know about these characters.
We do. It's called Apocrypha.
Oh, okay.
There are books called Apocrypha, like the books of Maccabees, famously, which are not part of the canon, but they tell the story of Hanukkah in 4 different ways.
Yes, RDY. That's what I'm hoping to explore.
I don't have any access to apocryphal texts on me. I'm looking quickly at Sepharia. I don't think
it's okay. I'm going to mention about the DC universe. It's just the recent shift, right? Because they are continuing some characters, right? James Gunn, at the time of this recording, has already announced that very few characters he's already decided will continue through to the new DC universe. Amanda Waller, some of the people from Peacemaker, the Weasel, they'll continue to the new DC universe. But right, Henry Cavill's not moving forward. Wonder Woman's not moving forward, as far as we know. A lot of those characters aren't moving, so they're like picking and choosing which of the previous DC movies and properties are still existent in this new universe because they're restarting.
So I'm looking at a list of apocryphal books that did not make the cut into the biblical canon. Mm-hmm. And I knew of like 4 or 5 of these, but there are like an easy dozen that are listed here. I knew of Tobit, Judith, Ben Sira, and Maccabees. I had heard of the Wisdom of Solomon, but there, Megillat Antiochus, which is another account of the Maccabees' victories over the Greco-Syrians. Book of Jubilees, retelling the biblical story from creation through Exodus as told to Moses by an angel. So, yeah, these are biblical style books that when the people who decided that these books were going to be in the Bible and these books were not, these are the ones that didn't make the cut. The word itself,
you mean when God decided, right?
No.
So that helps lead to the question of how do we decide what is canon and what is not?
Yeah. Well, and also Disney, like, I'm sorry, Disney is a great money-making machine, but they vomit content regularly, and there's a lot of content that we don't see because it doesn't, they make stuff and they go, oh, this is okay, we'll put it on Disney Plus and call it a day. And then the kid who's flipping channels or scrolling, I don't know what the
we need new metaphors now.
The kid who's doing the modern equivalent of flipping channels will like
they're on TikTok and they get to like a 1-minute clip.
Right. But they might discover this content, but it's mostly no good. It's very rare that Disney creates these days a Moana or a Frozen. Those are the rarities.
Yeah. Barak, you mentioned it a little bit, and I still want to pose the question out there of, what are other examples of things from nerd culture, of things that were once considered canon and now are not?
Well, we talked about the DC pieces. Marvel did this as well but they're starting to undo it in terms of forgetting all the Netflix shows or Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Now that's so fascinating too. We have an example of a bunch of things now being kind of like pulled into it.
Yeah, but not entirely though, right? They ignored the X-Men universe, and yet they still had Patrick Stewart play Professor X. But he was a variant, but what was that, right? Did that actually mean that all the previous iterations were existent because he died? Right.
Yeah, so I wrote down like the X-Men movie films and how the original trilogy kind of got overwritten by Days of Future Past once that came out, which was
also
an incredible thing.
In the comics, when Days of Future Past came out in the comics, they were able to reboot a lot of stuff.
Yeah. The Star Trek universe did this.
Well, they cheated.
Yeah.
And that's also a way in which Marvel is starting to cheat a little bit too, with the parallel universes or alternate timelines that don't overwrite, but allow us to explore different things, like pulling in Professor X into Multiverse of Madness.
And I'll have this more in research whenever I get to my Zelda episode, but in terms of Legend of Zelda, a lot of the original story had changed in terms of who Ganondorf was and his purpose and the storyline, right? Zelda to Zelda, game to game, overarchingly, it's mostly the same, but there are elements that they have sort of said, no, we're not going to do that. This is now the canon for what this trifecta of these characters are now. This is what we're going to be focusing on.
I know very little about Zelda, so maybe if you
I'll save it for the episode.
Put a link in the chat.
Oh, that was great. I loved that.
Pulling back to, of course, my first love being Star Trek, when you have 13 movies and literally hundreds upon hundreds of episodes, there are certain things that are just like, no, we're not going to talk about the episode where Tom Paris and Captain Janeway travel so quickly they turn into lizards. That's actually objectively a really stupid episode. But it's an episode. It happened. We just all collectively agreed we're not going to talk about that one.
Was it more or less stupid than Tupac and Nibor or whatever the
Tuvix?
You got you got one of the names. That was pretty good.
Yeah. Or one of the Next Generation episodes that now is like in hindsight extremely racist. We don't like to talk about that episode anymore.
Disney has that too. Disney has that. I forget the name of the movie that someone bought the rights to it and
Song of the South.
Song of the South. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's many TV shows where not that they're not considered canon, but for example, in Smallville, right, they had what you call the Freak of the Week, but these TV shows that are episodic, sometimes they just ignore what happens in the previous. There's not a lot of growth for characters, right? In Smallville's Freak of the Weeks, things would happen, and then it wouldn't really be effective of what's going on in the next episode. So they could move episodes around in a season, however if they wanted to, because there wasn't a lot of growth or change for them. And so not that they're not being considered, but they really have no impact on the story. So they could be forgotten if they ever wanted to, just like these ones you're talking about from Star Trek.
Yeah. So when we make the choice to exclude certain stories from Judaism or from Star Wars, two very comparable things, do we lose out on something? Like when we exclude the old expanded universe stories, when we exclude either parts of stories that we are perhaps excluding because they make us a little uncomfortable, or stories from these books that RDY mentioned, that like RDY, who was famously a rabbi and had to look these up quickly. Yes, famously.
Internationally.
Like, do we lose something? And I suppose it's even a hard question because, like, on the Jewish sense, all three of us here, at least not necessarily that super familiar with like these other stories that aren't told because they're not told.
I think so. Do we lose something was the start of the question. And yes, absolutely, we lose something. Is that a bad thing?
Maybe that's a better question.
I think no. And think about how the brain works and how, except for a very few people in the world, we forget. And forgetting is a blessing. Like, I don't want to remember the times that I've recovered from surgery. I don't want to remember every detail of every pain I have had, emotionally, physical, or otherwise, in my life. I want to forget things. And I'm not saying that the Star Wars stuff that we've forgotten is negative, but the section you read from Esther certainly is. It's not. The section you read from Esther is something we probably intentionally ignore when we tell it from year to year, just like we ignore parts about the spending one night with the entire harem, spending one night with King Ahasuerus, like we and Esther gets chosen on her night. It's not a beauty pageant, it's a sex trial. So we edit and modify partly to accommodate our modern understandings, what at whatever period of time that we are considering modern, and partly so that we can take in the digestible portion.
What you just said, the editing and deciding, this feels like this is Judaism, the director's cut, right? That there's a version that and that sounds like this is going to be the title for this episode.
I love that. I love that.
There are things that have been recorded and have been seen, heard, filmed, shot, lived, etc. And for some reason, it doesn't exist in the main story that we hear about. It's still out there. And sometimes we can go back and we can watch it again or see or read. But somebody has decided this is the story that we want to tell, right? Hearing about what you told in the book of Esther, that changes the story a little bit. It changes what we're thinking about, at least in that portion of the story. And so by excluding it, we create a narrative that I think best serves the purpose of what we're trying to do, as opposed to the story that we then hear if that is fully included and listened and discussed.
Yeah. So something that came to mind was and the irony here is this is now a non-canon Star Wars book that came out in 2008 called Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor. And the story was essentially that like Luke Skywalker General Skywalker, Jedi Skywalker were so tired of like these feats of his exploits being told, these dramatic tall tales, that he sits down with a New Republic reporter and tells this story. And the narration then turns into this big, gigantic, big story. At the end of the novel, the reporter stands up and goes, you know what? Like, I understand where you're coming from, but like, here's my ticket to make it big. I'm going to tell the big story. I'm going to call it Luke Skywalker in the Shadows of Mindor. And then like, that's kind of how the book ends. So the implication is that the book is actually this fancy reporter's retelling of a story Luke Skywalker told him. So like very, very, very meta of like, the telling of stories and what happens to their, or what happens to them. And again, from a Star Wars angle, something RDY that you were saying is that the Star Wars expanded universe before Disney took it over, to be very honest, was bloated. It was hard to track. In an earlier episode, when we talked about Rogue One, I mentioned there were something like 5 or 6 stories at this point about how the rebels stole the Death Star plans leading into A New Hope. And like, it was really hard to reconcile everything. And with Disney wiping things away and starting fresh, they're able to tell an incredible story in Rogue One and say definitively, here's what happened. Here is the story. And so I do think you're right. There is some value talking about memory and forgetting and being able to track things. One of the challenges the Star Wars universe came up with is they got stuck into a like, oh, here's this Imperial warlord we forgot of the week that the New Republic had to go after and go after and go after. They got stuck.
Were all of those Star Wars stories before Disney considered canon, like all of them, or or some of them outside of the source? Like, how do you know that they were considered part of the Star Wars George Lucas universe?
So generally speaking, if it happened on TV or film, it was kind of considered canon. So really, like if something took place in the movies or in the Clone Wars Cartoon Network show, not the animated one, but like the CG one that disagreed with the books, you would kind of default to the TV series. But all the Star Wars books that came out, like Timothy Zahn invented the characters of Grand Admiral Thrawn and Mara Jade and Talon Karrde. They appeared in subsequent books by other authors, in comics from other authors. And so there was a sort of maintained canon. Jason and Jaina Solo became characters in other book series. So there was a canon. It wouldn't be fair to call it a Lucas canon, because I think there's a famous story of someone talking to George Lucas and mentioned Ben Skywalker. And he goes, who? And he goes, yeah, that's Luke and Mara J's kid. And he goes, what? So like, canon maybe is in the eye of the beholder. But one of the now interesting things with Disney is because they have a story group, everything that comes out now is canon. The video games, the novels, they're designed to intersect and intertwine in really interesting ways.
There's an interesting, the question of like, who determines the canon? Like, who are the gatekeepers of what's canon, what's not? And I love that you mentioned that it was movies and TV meant it was canon. And movies and TV are accessible to a lot more people than those who read the books. And when it comes to certain canon, when it comes to Star Wars and Star Trek canon, I'm sure you've read a lot of the books, Ethan, and probably Barack, as your canon is the comic books that you've read. And my canon is the biblical stuff that I have access to. And yet we've all seen the MCU. Like, we've all seen the movies that were originated from comic books, from some comic books, because even the MCU picks and chooses which storylines are the ones that we're going to use, alter, or ignore. And so I love that the idea that it comes from movie watching and TV watching implies that it's the people who decide, that the more people who have access to it, the more likely it is to be canon. Now, unfortunately, I think what really happens is different than that, but I think there's still an implication there that it could be democratic process, dare I say.
Well, I'm curious now the overlap between what you just said and Jewish texts, right? Because Judaism directly has very few movies and TV shows coming out of the 5 books of Moses.
And even fewer good ones.
Right. And so what does that translate to in terms of how does Jewish culture decide what's kept and what's not kept, right? We talked at episode 18 about the Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins, which is a very well-known Hanukkah book. And none of us had any idea that Herschel was a Yiddish folklore hero because nobody talks about those stories. And so it's not that it's not canon, it's just forgotten or unused. And so the things that we know about most often, I would say, come from high holidays where most Jews attend, right? And so not that that's a visual medium, but you were there watching the shofar, eating the apples and honey, listening to the story of Jonah and Yom Kippur, right? The Esther story for the Purim spiels. The things that are most well known, I think, because of the visuals, right? The 10 Commandments are in many synagogues as a visual for their ark or for some other piece in the synagogue. And I'm trying to think of like other main stories. Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? So everybody knows. I think a lot of people know about Joseph the Dreamer, right? I'm trying to think of like the things.
I'm going to argue that one.
Oh, go ahead.
That's because of the play. That's.
Oh, so not right. Well, that it's still okay. So not synagogue based, right? Yeah. But
I would say
Passover Seder, everybody knows about the 10 plagues.
And if you're just going to go visuals, that idea of Esther suggesting that the sons of Haman be impaled, that's a visual. That's pretty stark.
And if anybody has not yet written your Game of Thrones Purim spiel, I think you have props department ahead of you.
God, oh man.
Maybe put Hamantaschens on like marshmallow skewers.
So RDY, you mentioned movies and TV being accessible. Going back to Star Wars, there was a book series called Republic Commando, and it dealt into Mandalorians and Mandalorian culture. And eventually, the Clone Wars TV show began to dive into Mandalore and Mandalorian culture. And the depiction on TV differed wildly from the books to the point that it overrode several of the books. And this was an ongoing series. And the writer, Karen Travis, eventually more or less resigned and stopped writing this book series because the TV show kept overwriting her book.
Oh. I don't know where we are in this world, but how can we make that happen to J.K. Rowling?
I'm sure there's some like forget spell we can make happen.
Can we just start because the stories were so good and she's so not good.
Well, I think there's a kernel for another episode there. So let's table that for now.
All right. So tabled.
So I have a few other questions. Is there a particular piece of literature, Jewish or nerd culture, that's non-canon that you personally adore or love is one of your favorites? Again, I think for me, I got to pull in the Timothy Zahn trilogy of books that are just a phenomenal read.
I think the Purim spiel I wrote on Star Wars is not part of the canon.
You don't think that's a part of the canon?
It's neither Purim canon nor Star Wars canon. Ooh. And I have real issue with that.
Oh, man.
I think the books of Maccabees, which are part of the Apocrypha I mentioned earlier, are some of my favorites. I love to teach about those, and especially the difference between how Hanukkah is celebrated according to the book of Maccabees, especially Second Maccabees, as opposed to how it's celebrated according to the Talmud.
I had gotten a book when I was much younger, and I don't remember much of it. I don't. I wish I did. I highly doubt that either property considers this canon. It is Star Trek The Next Generation meets the X-Men.
Definitely not canon.
It's a book called Planet X from like the late 90s. Awesome. Yeah, it was a crossover between the two series. There's no way that either universe considers that book canon. But Marvel, if you're listening, please take the rights to Star Trek too, and then let's have some sort of, I mean, Captain Picard now, right? with these two universes merged now, could you imagine what Planet X would look like?
Oh my God,
hysterical. There's also a crossover between Marvel and DC where different characters fought each other. They get like
that was a big thing
to one another, and it was a big thing, but it's not canon. But it's very familiar. People know it.
Yeah.
Okay, y'all. Time for the big, big question. Will Deadpool 3 be considered canonical in the MCU?
Has to be.
Yes.
And I hope that it brings 1 and 2 into the
Absolutely. You really think so?
I hope so. I mean,
even with Wolverine being back?
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
You don't think Deadpool 3 is going to be included in phase 6 or 7 whenever it comes out?
I don't know. I have no idea how you reconcile it. Maybe that's part of the fun, but
which
I think
is
Deadpool
why
allows that
for Kevin Feige.
Yeah.
But I mean, the Deadpool stories and movies are just so much fun. And when that first movie was coming out, I was so excited and just couldn't believe they were making a Deadpool. And like, I felt the same about Guardians of the Galaxy. And like, they're just reaching into these stories that have this ridiculousness on purpose that makes it so much fun. Also, if Deadpool becomes canon, then he becomes the first Marvel character to, outside of Cable to time travel.
Yeah. Well, I would even
I mean, yeah, but if he pulls Wolverine into it and Wolverine is canon, Wolverine time traveled in Days of Future Past, right?
Oh, right.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Actually.
Did I actually you? Yeah, oh my God, I'm sorry.
Well, actually.
And outside of the ridiculousness, even if Deadpool 3 is not considered Marvel phase whatever, they are starting to cross with the Sony properties, right? So Venom and Morbius had post-credit scenes including characters from the Marvel MCU. So while they're not directly in the Marvel phases, I think they're now considered Marvel canon, and there will be some explanation.
And Venom was in a post-credit for Spider-Man No Way Home.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's what I meant, right? Venom was in that post-credit, and he showed up. Well, in Venom 2, the post-credit brought him into Spider-Man No Way Home, and at the end of Spider-Man No Way Home, they resolved that post-credit. Yeah. But the post-credit of Morbius, he met because of the multiversal stuff, I believe, from No Way Home. The Vulture, Michael Keaton's The Vulture, showed up in the post-credits for Morbius. So there's these crossovers happening that while they're not Marvel canon properties, I think those are now being considered as Marvel canon. And I think we're going to get the same stuff from the Netflix shows that Daredevil is now in the MCU. So is the Daredevil stuff going to be canon? I've heard rumors that Jessica Jones and Luke Cage are going to come back.
God, I hope so.
And there
as long as they recast Iron Fist, we're good.
Right. And there was a trailer for Secret Invasion where, and this is purely theory on my part, where Nick Fury says, bring in the cavalry. But if you were an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. watcher, you know that the cavalry is talking about one specific person. And so it's very possible that they're going to be bringing Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. We already know that one of the actors from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is going to be in Secret Invasion. Oh. And so I think they're bringing Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. into the MCU if we're talking about canon. And they overlapped. We talked about it a little bit in a past episode. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. played with the MCU tangentially in their storylines, but never directly interfaced. And this would be the first time that they actually interfaced.
Except for Lady Sif. Lady Sif appeared in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Oh, okay, fine. Well, yes. And I believe Nick Fury showed up in an episode as well. There were other characters from Marvel that showed up, but there was no impact to the greater Marvel universe based on what was going on in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And I think there was
impact on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. as to what was happening.
Yes, in the correct. Yeah. But I don't know if they considered it Marvel canon. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think they're now going to be considering it canon in some way. So I think there's been a resolve for some of these pieces. And so I don't know if there are teachings or clergy or congregations or rabbinic institutions that are now teaching on texts and stories that have not been told in a while that will now become part of our canon, right? Hey, rabbis out there, the Herschel of Ostropol stories were fascinating. And I think if we want some other interesting characters for our children, maybe explore him a little bit more.
I'm also pretty sure that there have been rabbis out there who have taught about the Apocrypha.
Oh, as like courses, probably.
Yeah.
But nothing's caught on.
Well, so let me ask one last question. Is canon in the eye of the beholder?
I think it's the person who's beholding the eyes is really what it is. The person who's making those decisions, whoever that might be. I don't know if it's the beholder.
I think the beholder is society. If the beholder is society, then yes.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
And also, when I think of the eye of the beholder, I think of one giant eye and a bunch of little stalks with eyes on them. So, and for Susan, that's a beholder in Dungeons and Dragons. And the idea of us as a society deciding what is canon and what is not, I think is very much like what happened when the Bible was codified, that it was the people who were reading this stuff had to decide which parts they wanted in and which parts they wanted out, just like we do with the movies and the stories and the comic books and all of the stuff that we as movie watchers, as people who take in this entertainment, we do say, yay or nay. I mean, look at the Star Wars episodes that 1, 2, 3, and 7, 8, 9 that have very mixed opinions on it. Y'all know my opinions on them, but there are people who love them and people who don't. But are they canon? I would say yes.
So to understand what you're saying, RDY, society decides what's canon or not?
Yes.
So does this mean if I get enough of my friends together, we can decide, you know what, Disney, forget it?
I would say yes, but I'll also say I'm not going to say anything about you, but I don't have enough friends to do that.
Well, I don't either. And also I have very much enjoyed, I'm not going to say everything, but a lot of what Disney has done with Star Wars.
I do think there's a cultural aspect to it. And maybe these like large voices help to make those decisions. And those prequels, the sequels, they made enough money for Star Wars, for Disney, et cetera, that I don't think it was enough for them to say, no, let's forget that happened, right? But for some reason, DC keeps saying, no, let's forget that happened, because it was so poorly received that those are now not canon, even though they're movies.
And I want to say that I think there's a difference between a line between that and like whiny fanboys on the internet, like trying to farm outrage to grow their channels. Like, I want to draw a distinction between what I'm saying and like the people for whom there will never be enough, and I can't believe they're doing this and they're changing Star Wars and that's not really Star Trek, and release the Snyder cut. Like there's a difference.
Haters for the sake of hating, or like haters because I know so much more about it than you do. Yeah.
Well, there's also that Jewish. I think there's that Jewish synagogue member part in there of like, but we've always done it that way. We can't change it. Right. I think that's part of their complaint also. I mean, that's
interesting. Like I saw what RDY was saying, like the hating for the sake of hate is the professional, actually people versus, synagogue members who are uncomfortable with change. I think there's a difference. There's a lot of similarities, but I think there's a like good intentions versus bad intentions difference between the two.
Sure.
Your description there of the differences just popped into my head another piece of canon that we have left out for years and years, and that is Bilhah and Zilpah. That in the 80s or so, when we decided that we're going to add the imahot, the mothers, to our prayer, and when we say God, we used to say God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and be done. Then we added Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, or Rachel and Leah, depending on what decade it is. And only recently have we started to add Bilhah and Zilpah, because when we added the mothers, we said, well, we got to acknowledge the women too, so let's add their wives. But we forgot that Bilhah and Zilpah are, between the two of them, responsible for 1/3 of Israel, of the tribes of Israel. So we need to recognize families that don't look like ours, as well as the typical families that we used to acknowledge alone. And so sometimes that discomfort is not just a matter of, I like it this way, but it's a matter of, I am seeing something in myself that I'm struggling to change. And I don't want to admit that I used to be sexist or racist or anti-LGBTQ. I just want to acknowledge what I am today. But we have to change our liturgy and we have to change our stories to reflect who we are.
I think that's beautiful. That's great. All right, y'all. Any closing thoughts?
This was great. I love this.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
and maybe people won't, and we just won't include it in future listings of our episodes.
That's true.
Episode 27, the skippable episode.
Or the lost episode.
Yeah, right.
So much better.
This is great. Thank y'all so much. This was a topic, and Barack knows this, that I really struggled to figure out this episode. And just in 2 minutes of brainstorming, I was like, oh, wait, I know where I can take this. And I really enjoyed this conversation.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Well,
much.
May the 4th be with you, everybody.
Yes, and also with you.
Yeah. And if you celebrate the other side, then happy Revenge of the 5th. All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Torah Smash. Our fiscal sponsor is Jewish Creativity International. Our theme music was created by Sean Fogel. You can check out Sean's bands and studio work at www.thesleepywest.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to rate and review us wherever you listen. It helps others find us and is an excellent way to support the podcast. We want to hear from you and continue today's nerdy discussion. Go to torahsmash.com to find where to connect with us online, purchase swag from our store, support us with a donation, find previous episodes, and more. And this podcast may not sound like much, but she's got it where it counts, kids.
It's true.
Should I redo that one?
No, that was great. Keep going. Finish that sentence.